What would you do if you stumbled upon a letter from a man long dead? A man whose wisdom once guided armies of witches and wizards, whose choices decided the fate of worlds, and whose secrets even now hum quietly beneath the stone floors of Hogwarts. The parchment is soft as old skin, the wax seal deep blue and cracked in the center, embossed with two simple letters, a D. You hesitate before touching it because you know that Albus Dumbledore's letters were never just letters. They were spells in disguise, fragments of thought bound to the person bold enough to read them. It's late, far past curfew. The castle asleep except for the ghosts who patrol out of habit. Moonlight spills across the headmaster's desk, catching on silver instruments that click and purr faintly, like cats dreaming of algebra. You slide your fingers beneath the flap, expecting dust, but what you find is warmth, as though the paper still remembers the hand that wrote it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. That's what Dumbledore might have said if he were alive in this era of screens and whispering microphones. He always had a flair for turning every request into a moral lesson. You laugh softly, then unfold the page. The handwriting is unmistakable. Curly, elegant, just a little arrogant. The ink hasn't faded. It gleams faintly gold, as if enchanted to resist time. To whomever finds this, it begins. You may not know it yet, but you are part of the story I never finished. The words send a shiver up your spine. You glance around the office, portraits pretending to sleep, a globe spinning without wind, and realize that the air has changed. Something unseen has leaned closer. He writes of beginnings, of a boy too clever for his own soul, born in the village of Godric's Hollow during a time when magic still hummed through the soil like electricity waiting for invention. The village is real, of course. Muggles still live there. But the scholars argue endlessly about how much of the Dumbledore legend was fact. Some claim his brilliance was inherited from an ancient line of alchemists, perhaps even the fabled Nicola Flamel's circle. Others, more cautious, whisper that his genius was simply the byproduct of grief, that every spell he created was an apology carved into light. There's even a fringe theory, and Dumbledore would hate this, that he was a seer who saw too far ahead, glimpsing futures not meant for human minds. You can almost hear him chuckling at that. Outside, the wind nudges the window open. The night smells of rain and ink. You read on, tracing the story of a childhood built on silence. His father imprisoned for attacking Muggles, his mother raising her children in a house full of secrets. You picture young Albus studying by candlelight while his sister Ariana hummed softly to herself in another room. The letter doesn't mention what happened to her yet, but you feel it coming, like thunder behind the mountains. Dumbledore's tone is gentle but weighted, a confession disguised as recollection. He writes, "Knowledge, when held too tightly, can become a cage. And I was a most diligent jailer." You pause, the castle breathing around you, portraits sighing in their sleep. There's a comfort in his words, even when they ache. You've heard that real letters can hold traces of the writer's mind, a magical residue scholars once called ink memory. It's said to be most powerful in letters written at the hour of death, when truth outweighs pride. Maybe this is such a letter. You imagine him in his final days, sitting by that same desk, his wand light trembling as he wrote, unsure whether the world he left behind would forgive him or even understand. You reach the end of the first page, but something compels you to keep going. The quills in their stand rustle faintly, the portraits shift, and you swear one of them, Phineas Nigellus perhaps, mutters, "About time someone read that." You smile. Maybe this is all imagination. Maybe the letter is only paper. But you've already felt the first tug of Dumbledore's last mystery, and you can't stop now. I'm really curious. From which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The office feels different now, as if the very air remembers him. You sit in Dumbledore's old chair, high-backed, cracked with age, and smelling faintly of lemon drops and parchment, and let the letter's second page rest against your knees. The moonlight from the tower window slides across the floor in long, silvery bars, and every ticking clock in the room seems to have adjusted its rhythm to match your heartbeat. Somewhere above, a phoenix feather shimmers in a glass case, catching the candlelight like a living flame. The first line of the new page is short, almost tender. If you are reading this, then Hogwarts has survived. You read it again, slower this time, tasting each word. It's not a boast. It's relief, maybe even disbelief, as though he truly wasn't sure the castle would stand after everything that came. You glance at the portraits along the walls, some still pretending to nap, others watching quietly through half-lidded eyes. The one nearest you, a sleepy Armando Dippet, mutters something about noise at this hour and goes still again. You whisper an apology that makes no sound. The next paragraph unfurls like a memory spell. Dumbledore describes his years as headmaster not as power, but as penance. Every sunrise, he writes, I walk this room like a ghost pretending to be a man. He tells of the inventions scattered across his desk, silver spheres that caught whispers of prophecy, hourglasses filled with the sands of students' laughter, a portrait frame that painted itself only when no one was looking. The details are so vivid you almost hear the faint hum of old magic beneath the wood. He speaks of the many letters he wrote and never sent, addressed to people long gone, his brother Aberforth, whose forgiveness came too late, Grindelwald, whose prison cell he could never bring himself to visit again, and Ariana, whose silence haunted him even when the school was full of song. There's one moment that stops you. I feared my legacy would become a museum exhibit, he admits. Tidy, safe, stripped of failure. But I wanted them to remember that wisdom is nothing without the wounds that earned it. That line feels like it's written to you personally, to everyone who grew up believing he was flawless. You think of how history often polishes its heroes until they shine unnaturally bright. The historians of the wizarding world still debate whether Dumbledore's mentorship of Harry Potter was compassion or manipulation, a question that keeps entire symposiums arguing for days. One scholar, a sharp-tongued witch from the Department of Mysteries, once proposed that his brilliance wasn't in his magic, but in his theatrics, that his greatest spell was convincing the world that redemption looked graceful. It's a theory you imagine Dumbledore would have adored. Halfway down the page, a faint shimmer ripples through the parchment. The ink shifts, rearranging itself, and for a moment the handwriting seems alive. The instruments on the shelves, those delicate little contraptions of brass and glass, begin to stir. One starts ticking in reverse, another releases a thin thread of blue smoke that shapes itself into the outline of a hand. You don't move. The hand points gently toward the window, where the reflection of your face merges with Dumbledore's in the moonlight, like teacher and student caught in the same spell. It's a small illusion, perhaps triggered by whoever touches the letter, a charm meant to remind you that learning was never one way. He writes, magic is not in the wand, but in the choice. It is the smallest kindness, the smallest truth, that shapes the world most deeply. You can hear his voice saying it, that calm tone that made even the gravest revelations sound like bedtime stories. You remember the way he could make danger feel educational, as if being nearly killed by dark wizards was a learning opportunity. There's even a dry joke tucked in the letter. I often found that chaos made the best classroom, though I suspect Minerva would still disagree. You grin. Even in his confessions, the man couldn't resist wit. And yet, beneath it all, there's weariness, a tone that suggests a man trying to clean a mess too vast for any spell. You notice a faint watermark behind the text, a sigil shaped like a triangle enclosing a circle and a line. The Deathly Hallows. He's about to tell you more, but the ink fades before it can finish the thought. Perhaps the spell that animates the letter releases its story piece by piece, forcing you to linger, to breathe, to listen. The clock behind you strikes once, The sound echoes through the chamber like a pulse, and every candle flickers as if exhaling. You place the page down gently, afraid it might crumble under the weight of time. For a moment, you close your eyes. You imagine him here, pacing between those same walls, muttering to himself about destiny and dinner schedules, while Fawkes watched from his perch. There's comfort in that image. The notion that even the greatest wizard of his age once worried about paperwork. Outside, thunder murmurs far off in the highlands, rolling over the lake like a lullaby. When you open your eyes again, the next page of the letter has already turned itself, waiting. The third page begins with a line that almost feels like an incantation. To understand me, you must first understand the silence I was born into. You take a slow breath. The parchment seems older now, darker around the edges, as though you've stepped backward in time just by touching it. The candle beside you hisses faintly. The flame leans toward the letter as if eager to listen too. Dumbledore's handwriting flows softer here, the loops longer, the strokes deliberate, like a man unburdening himself of ghosts, one curve at a time. He takes you back to Godric's Hollow, where cobblestone streets glimmered with rain and the Dumbledore house stood apart from the others, a little too quiet, a little too strange. The neighbors whispered. Of course they did. They said the Dumbledores kept secrets in their cellar, that the windows glowed blue on moonless nights. Some of that was true. His father, Percival, was a man of pride and temper, and one evening, after a cruel attack on young Ariana by Muggle boys, that temper ignited like wildfire. History books record only that he lost control. Dumbledore's letter paints a far sharper picture. He writes of the moment he realized that brilliance could not save the people he loved. I thought intellect was armor, he admits, but it was only glass. His mother, Kendra, withdrew from the world after that, hiding Ariana's unstable magic from both the ministry and the neighbors. Dumbledore and his brother grew up like two sides of a coin. Aberforth, fierce and grounded. Albus, lost in thought, chasing truths too big for one lifetime. The letter lingers on their home. The smell of lilac tea, the uneven floors, the old piano Ariana liked to sit beside, even though she never played it. Magic, Dumbledore writes, was not forbidden in our house. It was feared. It hummed like a storm waiting for a reason. You can almost hear the faint music of it, that restless hum beneath the floorboards. And then comes a curious passage, a memory folded into ink. The page ripples slightly, and before your eyes, faint figures bloom upon the surface, glowing gold like ghosts of light. A young Dumbledore, hair shorter, eyes too serious for his age, sits by a window writing equations in midair. Behind him, his sister twirls a strand of her hair, laughing without sound, while their mother watches from the doorway, her face a mix of love and dread. You blink, and the image fades. Dumbledore notes that he bound fragments of his memories into the letter, so that the reader may walk through what words alone cannot hold. You smile despite yourself. Trust Dumbledore to turn even a confession into a tutorial. As the story deepens, the humor flickers in, gentle as candle smoke. He jokes about his youthful arrogance. At 15, I considered myself the wisest soul since Merlin. In hindsight, I was probably less useful than a broken remembrall. You laugh quietly. It's a strange comfort, realizing the greatest wizard who ever lived once tripped over his own ego. Yet beneath that wit lies sorrow too human to disguise. He writes of the nights Ariana's magic burst uncontrolled, walls cracking, air trembling, the sky itself bending with her pain. We called it a fit, he says, but it was really grief seeking a language. That sentence lingers long after you read it, because somewhere inside, you recognize it. We all do. A scholarly aside slips in next, almost like a footnote. He references an obscure magical theory proposed by Bathilda Bagshot, the idea that trauma can imprint itself on magic, altering its very frequency. It's a fringe belief, dismissed by the academic elite, but Dumbledore hints he believed it. Magic remembers emotion, he writes. It carries it forward, like ink that refuses to dry. Some historians claim this is why Godric's Hollow feels charged even centuries later. Visitors say their wands buzz faintly there, as if the earth itself hums with old sadness. It's never been proven, of course, but you suspect Dumbledore wouldn't have cared much about proof anyway. The letter softens near its end, as if the weight of confession has tired even the ink. If I could go back, he writes, I would tell my younger self that love is not an interruption to greatness. It is its measure. That line feels like the heart of the letter, glowing quietly on the page. You read it again, slower this time, until it settles somewhere behind your ribs. The sound of rain returns, tapping the tower window like polite applause. Then, almost mischievously, Dumbledore adds one last note for this section. You may think the next part of my story is where the real trouble begins. You would be absolutely correct. The letters shimmer faintly, as if amused by your anticipation. The candles flicker, a book slides from a shelf by itself, and you can't help but grin, because of course he'd add dramatic timing to a posthumous letter. You lean forward, ready for whatever truth the next page will unravel. The next page unfurls with a breath of cold air, carrying the faint smell of burned parchment and ozone, as if the ink itself remembers lightning. The handwriting sharpens, no longer the calm reflection of an old man, but the restless script of a young wizard standing on the edge of history. There are moments, Dumbledore begins, when intellect becomes a mirror and shows you only yourself. That is when you are in the most danger. You settle deeper into his chair, heart thudding softly because you already know what's coming. The chapter of his life the wizarding world still can't decide whether to admire or condemn. He writes of meeting Gellert Grindelwald, that brilliant hurricane of a boy, as he calls him, who arrived in Godric's Hollow like a comet looking for someone to burn beside. The historians have always argued about the nature of their friendship. Some insist it was purely academic, a union of two geniuses. Others whisper about something deeper, tenderer, doomed before it began. Dumbledore, in his letter, refuses to clarify. There are bonds that do not fit into words, he writes simply, and some truths wither the moment they are spoken aloud. You can almost see them. Two young men pacing through wildflower fields, parchment notebooks filled with sketches of new spells, talking until dawn about reshaping the world. Dumbledore calls that summer the season of certainty. He believed they were destined to save humanity from itself. Grindelwald spoke of uniting wizards and muggles under enlightened rule, for the greater good, a phrase Dumbledore admits he loved too easily. I mistook eloquence for wisdom, he confesses, and I mistook brilliance for kindness. It's strange how that single slogan still appears in wizarding political debates, usually by those who haven't learned what it truly cost. One modern scholar even claims the phrase influenced the International Statute of Secrecy's later reforms, though others argue it was erased deliberately from history to protect Dumbledore's reputation. As you read, the quills on the desk begin to move faintly on their own, sketching drifting patterns in the dust, interlocking circles and stars as if recalling the diagrams they once drew together. The light in the room dims until only the candle beside you remains, flickering against the glass cabinet where Fawkes once perched. Dumbledore's words take on a rhythm like confession turned into prayer. He spoke, and I followed. Not because I was weak, but because I wanted to believe that genius and goodness were the same thing. They are not. The page hums slightly under your fingertips, as if the parchment itself vibrates with regret. He describes their late-night experiments, the ones not found in any textbook, spells that could store thought, reverse decay, and extract memory from air. Together they sought what they called the mastery of death. Grindelwald's obsession was with the three mythical artifacts: the Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, and the Cloak of Invisibility. Dumbledore confesses that at first he treated the Hallows as a philosophical metaphor, a riddle about mortality. He wanted to conquer death, Dumbledore writes. I only wanted to understand it. But in chasing him, I became his reflection. That single line could fill a library of essays. In fact, it already has. There's an entire Department of Magical History seminar titled Duality in the Dumbledore-Grindelwald Correspondence, where professors still argue over whether Dumbledore ever truly renounced that dream. Then, for the first time, the letter trembles. The ink runs slightly at the edges, like tears trying not to fall. The night it ended, he continues, was not marked by thunder or prophecy, only by silence, then a sound like glass breaking. He doesn't name Ariana, not yet, but the space between sentences is heavy with her ghost. You realize this is where the letter itself changes temperature. The parchment feels warmer, almost feverish. You can sense his shame pulsing through every stroke of ink. He admits that he saw the danger but didn't stop it, that brilliance blinded him to the human cost. We were boys who thought ourselves gods, he writes. We summoned storms and were surprised when they struck us. A soft laugh escapes you, half in awe, half in disbelief. Even in regret, he can't resist metaphor. It's like he's tutoring the reader one last time, teaching humility through spectacle. A curious historical note follows. He references an obscure magical text called The Canticle of Living Fire, supposedly written by an alchemist who claimed that emotion itself fuels magic. Most historians call the book apocryphal, but Dumbledore's mention of it here is tantalizing. He suggests Grindelwald may have read it too, perhaps drawing from it his twisted vision of emotional power as domination. The academic in you wants to pause, cross-reference, take notes, but the letter won't let you. The ink begins to fade at the edges again, urging you to keep moving. Near the bottom of the page, his tone shifts from confession to benediction. Forgive him, if you can. He was everything I could have been if I had not been loved, even once, even briefly. You stare at that sentence for a long time, because it feels larger than just history. It's about every person who has ever stood at the fork between pride and mercy. The candle burns lower, the wax pooling like spilled light. In the corner, one portrait, perhaps Dumbledore's own, smiles faintly, almost approvingly. You close the page slowly, heart steady now. The next section will tell of what came after, the night the silence shattered and the world learned how fragile even genius can be. The parchment feels heavier now, as if the air itself resists what comes next. When you unfold the 5th page, a faint shimmer passes over the words, and you realize it has been spelled to hide certain sentences until the reader is ready. Dumbledore's way of ensuring pain arrives only when deserved. The handwriting trembles, uneven for the first time, as though written by a hand that could not decide whether to continue. There are moments so loud that history itself forgets how to breathe, he begins. The night Ariana died was one of them. The candle flame falters. You lean forward, barely breathing, because this is the night that shaped everything. The one story even the portraits refused to discuss aloud. Dumbledore's words do not dramatize. They whisper, and that is somehow worse. He writes of the argument in their home, of Aberforth's fury, of Grindelwald's arrogance, of his own silence. 3 wands raised, 3 voices shouting, he recalls, and 1 heartbeat too fragile to withstand the echo. There is no spell named, no blame cast. Just a pause, a smudge of ink where a tear must have fallen. A flash of light, he continues, and then nothing but the smell of ash. You feel it, the weight of an entire life collapsing into a single breath. The air in the office seems to tighten, the portraits turning their faces away. You imagine young Dumbledore kneeling on that cold floor, the night air trembling around him, the realization crawling across his mind like frost. The world remembers him as a titan of intellect, but this letter shows the moment he first became human. I could have stopped it, he writes, but I was too proud to admit that love is louder than logic. His guilt seeps through every line. For years, historians believed he never spoke of that night again, but this letter proves otherwise. He turned his grief into secrecy, his sorrow into purpose, and his silence into legend. You can almost hear the echo of his words in the present, all those speeches about choice, forgiveness, sacrifice. They were rehearsals for forgiving himself. The page trembles again. A faint image unfolds just for a moment, drawn in pale gold ink. 3 figures frozen mid-duel, their spells colliding in a burst of light. Then it fades, leaving behind a faint burn mark in the parchment's center. You can smell the faint scent of ozone, as if the memory itself scorched through time to reach you. Dumbledore's tone softens. I once thought I could undo that moment by saving others. I built my life as a monument to her absence. Every child I guided was another candle lit for the sister I failed to protect. You realize this is where the myth of the merciful headmaster began, not in triumph, but in atonement. He shifts briefly into reflection, the teacher emerging again, even in confession. He cites an obscure historical fact about magical duels of that era. Back then, most wizards believed the wand's loyalty followed passion, not power. It's a curious reminder that emotion, anger, grief, love could turn a spell's aim ever so slightly. Historians will argue forever about whose curse killed her, he writes, but the truth is simpler. We all did. And perhaps that is why none of us deserved the Elder Wand. The quill strokes on the page deepen here, digging into the parchment as if the confession required force. You think about that line for a long moment. The Elder Wand, the Death Stick, the most powerful wand ever crafted, was already haunting the edges of his story, waiting like a vulture for its turn. In this moment, it feels less like a weapon and more like a curse that feeds on regret. A fringe theory you once read surfaces in your mind, that the wand itself chooses those who understand death most intimately. Perhaps that's why it came to Dumbledore in the end, not as reward, but punishment. He doesn't say this outright, of course. Instead, he jokes in passing, I once tried to donate it to the Ministry for Educational Display. They politely declined. You laugh softly, startled by the absurd humor amid tragedy, and somehow it makes the sadness sharper. Then, quieter. Aberforth and I buried her beneath the lilac tree she loved. He would not speak to me for years. Perhaps he was right not to. You can almost see them, 2 brothers standing apart under a gray dawn, the scent of lilac mixing with the damp earth. That single image feels like it belongs in some lost painting of wizarding history, the birth of sorrow disguised as mythology. The letter continues. I did not leave Godric's Hollow that morning because I was brave, but because I could no longer stand to see the house that remembered her better than I could. That line cracks something open inside you. For all the decades of legend that followed, for every polished tale told in classrooms, this was the truth. A man fleeing his own shadow. Outside, thunder rolls again across the Scottish Highlands. The sound doesn't frighten you, it fits. The castle has heard this story before. It just never told it aloud. You place your hand on the parchment, tracing the faint grooves his quill carved. The ink glows faintly, then settles, as if relieved that someone finally read what it had been holding for so long. You realize that Dumbledore's letter isn't just a confession, it's a resurrection, one memory at a time. The candle beside you flickers low. Somewhere above, you imagine the faint echo of phoenix wings, reminding you that ashes aren't always endings. The 6th page feels calmer to the touch, as though the storm has passed, but the air still hums with aftershocks. The ink is steadier again, and Dumbledore's script opens with a single, deliberate line. After Ariana, I did not seek greatness. I sought silence. You can almost hear his voice as you read it, that soft professorial murmur that could make a prophecy sound like a bedtime story. He writes of the years that followed, how he left Godric's Hollow behind and vanished into libraries across Europe, studying everything from ancient runes to alchemical ethics, desperate to find meaning where guilt refused to loosen its grip. The historians usually skip over this era, dismissing it as his wandering years. But his letter paints them differently, not a retreat, but an exile. I buried myself in knowledge, he writes, hoping that wisdom might make a less dangerous companion than love. He recalls how Hogwarts eventually called him back, not as a prodigal son, but as a reluctant teacher. It was Minerva, he mentions almost fondly, who reminded me that running from the past is still a kind of cowardice. You smile at that. You can picture her, young and sharp-eyed, folding her arms while daring even Albus Dumbledore to argue. He returned to the castle as a professor of transfiguration, a man determined to teach others control because he had so little over himself. Each student was a reflection, he writes. Some mirrored my hope, others my mistakes. There's a tenderness in those words, an affection that seeps through even his formality. He describes one boy who could turn an entire desk into a peacock, but could never remember his homework. Another girl who once transformed her teacup into a tiny sleeping cat that purred through exams. You can almost see Dumbledore chuckling at the memory, that twinkle in his eye, though here, the twinkle reads more as survival than charm. And then, quietly, the tone shifts. The world was changing again, he writes. Whispers of dark wizards returning, of ideologies dressed as progress. He doesn't name Grindelwald yet, but you can feel the shadow stretching back toward him, like history testing whether forgiveness can hold. He describes how the ministry began recruiting young talents into politics, while he remained at Hogwarts, convinced that education, not power, was the truest defense against evil. There's irony in that, of course. Decades later, that belief would lead him to Harry. You wonder if he knew even then that he was preparing for another war. Halfway down the page, he mentions an obscure historical moment, a summit in Geneva where wizarding scholars gathered to discuss the ethics of magical deterrence. It sounds almost bureaucratic until he notes that Grindelwald himself had agents there, disguised as academics. I did not attend, Dumbledore writes, for I feared seeing the reflection of my own ideas on their lips. That's the first real hint that his guilt never stopped chasing him. Some fringe historians claim that meeting, the so-called Geneva Circle, laid the philosophical groundwork for Grindelwald's later rise. Whether or not that's true, it fits too neatly to ignore. The humor creeps back in next, light but deliberate. I once attempted to join the Wiesengemot, he confesses, but I found their meetings dreadfully dull. Democracy, it turns out, is even slower than transfiguration. You laugh under your breath. There's something disarmingly human about picturing him impatiently doodling in the margins of policy notes while the rest of the council argued about cauldron thickness regulations. It's as though he's reminding you that wisdom isn't constant. It's a daily choice to not run away. As the page continues, his reflections become more personal. He speaks of students who reminded him what goodness looks like when it's still unscarred by the world. They believed in light without proof, he writes, and that belief was contagious. He mentions how Hogwarts' moving staircases once drove him mad until he realized they were teaching patience better than any lecture could. He muses that magic itself seems designed to humble the arrogant, and you think of every spell that misfires, every charm that surprises even the caster, a universe constantly whispering, "You are not in control." There's one particularly striking passage near the bottom. When history looks at war, he writes, it counts casualties and crowns. But the true war is fought between a man and his own memory. You pause there, feeling the truth of it. He explains that his duel with Grindelwald, years later, wasn't just between two wizards. It was between the man he had become and the boy he used to be. I did not fight him to save the world, he admits. I fought him because I could no longer bear what he reminded me of. Scholars still debate that line endlessly, whether he means he fought for redemption or simply for silence. Either way, the honesty of it feels like oxygen. The page ends softer than it began. If I seemed kind, it was because I remembered cruelty too well. If I seemed patient, it was because I once ran out of time. The handwriting steadies, the ink cools, and for a moment, you can almost sense his peace returning, like the tide after a storm. You set the parchment down and realize how still the office has become. Even the portraits seem contemplative now, no longer watching, just listening. The next page waits beneath your fingertips, heavier, darker. You know it will speak of wands and power and that lonely, terrible tower that everyone whispers about but no one truly understands. The 7th page is the first to feel alive under your hands. warm, humming faintly, like it remembers the pulse of the man who wrote it. The ink glows with a subtle silvery sheen, and when you tilt the parchment toward the candlelight, faint shapes appear beneath the words, a line, a circle, and a triangle. The Deathly Hallows, barely visible, as though the story itself is marked by the same symbol that haunted his life. The script begins gently, with that familiar mix of candor and restraint. There is no power in the world more seductive than the illusion of control. You exhale slowly. This is the section where myth meets man, where Dumbledore finally writes about the Elder Wand, that restless artifact that history still whispers about in taverns and classrooms. He admits that by the time he acquired it, he no longer believed in its legend, but he also confesses that belief and truth often intertwine like ivy. He describes it not as a trophy, but as a burden with memory. It knew me, he writes. It hummed when I was near, like a creature sniffing out its next host. The detail chills you. Wizards for centuries argued whether the wand was sentient or merely cursed, but here Dumbledore treats it like both, a relic of brilliance gone feral. He recounts the day he won it from Grindelwald, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. He fell, and I caught him, Dumbledore writes. The wand rolled between us like a dying ember. It did not choose me out of virtue, only proximity. That sentence alone could rewrite half the textbooks at the Ministry's Department of Magical History. You can imagine the debates already. Scholars sipping fire whiskey at dusty conferences, arguing whether destiny can be accidental. There's a lighter moment mid-page that almost feels like a sigh of relief. The wand demanded attention, he says. It sulked if left untouched. A drama queen of wood and core. You smile at that, grateful for the flicker of humor. Even confessing to cosmic responsibility, he manages to sound like a man complaining about an overgrown pet. But his tone darkens again quickly. Every spell I cast with it felt heavier than the last. It made miracles feel like debts. You pause, letting that sink in. The line reminds you of something a modern magical philosopher once wrote, that the Elder Wand amplifies not the wizard's power, but his conscience. Maybe that's why Dumbledore could bear it longer than most. He weaves in a factual thread here, almost as if teaching again. He notes that early wand lore traced the Elder Wand's wood to elder trees that grew near burial grounds, their roots feeding on the soil of decay and renewal. The elder tree, he reminds, has always been symbolic of passage between life and death, used in protective charms but also in funeral rites. It was never meant for battle, he insists. Its true nature was healing twisted by fear. You find that detail fascinating, how easily magic bends toward the temperament of its wielder. Historians still debate whether the wand's loyalty follows strength or intent. Dumbledore seems to suggest it follows regret. A faint glimmer travels down the parchment then, forming words that almost weren't there before. The night I held it last, he writes, I felt it humming like a heartbeat beneath my skin. It wanted release. You realize he's referring to his plan with Snape, the act that would end his life. I had become its prisoner, he continues. I did not fear death, but I feared leaving it behind for someone unready. Power is never buried. It waits. It's strange how he can make inevitability sound almost merciful. You sense that this part of the letter was written near the end, when his hand must have trembled from more than age. He mentions one fringe theory here, something historians usually dismiss as poetic nonsense. Some claim the Elder Wand weaves the will of death itself, he notes, that it does not serve its master, but rather escorts them to the end they have earned. You can imagine the outrage of rational academics reading that line, yet in this context, it feels hauntingly plausible. Dumbledore was never one to separate myth from moral. Perhaps that is why it came to me, he muses. It knew I would treat it not as a weapon, but as a confession. The tone softens toward the end, that gentle sadness returning like twilight. He admits that sometimes when the castle slept, he would place the wand on the windowsill and watch it gleam under the moonlight. I wondered, he writes, if it longed for peace as much as I did. There's something profoundly human about imagining the greatest wizard of the age watching his weapons sleep beside him like a restless pet. The humor flickers back, barely a breath. It never snored, though I suspect it wanted to. You laugh quietly. He must have known the effect it would have, this rhythm of heaviness and lightness, like waves guiding you closer to shore. And as you reach the end of the page, a final sentence appears, etched faintly as if whispered directly onto the paper. The wand's final lesson was simple. Even the mightiest tool cannot absolve the hands that hold it. The ink fades into stillness. You set the parchment down and realize you're holding your breath. The next page waits like a held exhale, the one that will finally lead him up that lonely tower, the place where all his choices meet their end. The 8th page is darker, the parchment itself slightly singed at the corners, as if touched by a spark that refused to die. The handwriting, though still elegant, drifts at times toward exhaustion. Every ending I planned was a kindness disguised as cruelty. It begins, and you instantly know where this is going. The last walk to the astronomy tower. The air around you feels charged. Even the candle beside you seems to dim, its flame pulling inward, sensing the gravity of what's about to be told. Dumbledore's tone here isn't grand or self-justifying. It's weary, the voice of a man explaining a mercy no one would ever understand. "You will hear stories of my death," he writes. Some painted as sacrifice, others as manipulation. Both are true. All stories are. From the right angle, you let that sentence sit for a while. It feels like his entire life condensed into one sigh. He begins the story far earlier than expected, not on the tower, but in a quiet room weeks before, where he and Severus Snape spoke for the last time without masks. "I had already seen my end," Dumbledore confesses, "for the curse upon my hand was a patient executioner." You picture that blackened hand, veins like threads of shadow. He admits that even the Elder Wand could not stop it, only delay it, and that Snape, brilliant, bitter, terrified Snape, was the only one he trusted to make the impossible humane. "He hated me for asking," he writes, "but he hated himself more for caring." There's a tremor in that line, and for a moment, you almost pity them both. Two men bound by the one thing they never said out loud, love, in its strangest and most painful form. The letter drifts between memory and confession. He describes the castle that night, how it seemed to sense the coming tragedy. "The portraits held their breath," he writes. "Even the staircases stopped their restless wandering." He recalls walking the corridors one last time, tracing his fingers along the cold stone. Every corner of Hogwarts held a memory, a duel, a laugh, a lesson. "It was the only home I ever built that forgave me," he says. That line alone could make a ghost weep. You imagine him stopping beneath the floating candles of the Great Hall, listening to their quiet crackle as though they were whispering farewell. Midway through the page, Dumbledore turns unexpectedly reflective, almost academic again, as if retreating into explanation to keep from feeling too much. He mentions a peculiar magical concept called transference of intent, a rare kind of spell work where emotion shapes destiny as much as action. "That night," he writes, "was not about death. It was about ownership of choice. I would not let Voldemort own my end." The historians still argue over whether he orchestrated his death purely for tactical advantage or as an act of spiritual control. Here, at least, the truth is simpler. He wanted to die on his own terms by a hand that meant mercy, not malice. And then, suddenly, humor flickers again. "I did, however, request that Severus wait until after my dramatic plea for help," he adds. A bit theatrical, perhaps, but one must maintain reputation to the end. You can't help but smile, even as your throat tightens. That's Dumbledore, making death itself sound like an appointment he was slightly late for. He recounts the moment on the tower without embellishment. "The air was cold, the sky clear," he writes. "I remember thinking how beautiful it was to die beneath such indifferent stars." He describes Draco's trembling wand, the fear behind those gray eyes, and how mercy once again became a performance. "He was a boy pretending to be a killer," Dumbledore recalls, and I was a dying man pretending to be invincible. We were both actors in a tragedy neither had written. When Snape appeared, there was no surprise, only relief. He met my eyes, Dumbledore writes. He understood. For the first time, I think we both did. Then a pause, a long one, an ink blot like a held breath. The green light was not pain, he says finally. It was release. You stop reading for a moment. The candle flame has steadied, as if even fire respects silence. There's a stillness in the room now that feels holy. Dumbledore's final lines on the page feel almost like poetry. If death is a mirror, then I was lucky to see kindness in mine. Tell them not to mourn a man who knew his ending and chose it smiling. A faint shimmer travels across the parchment then, revealing one last note at the bottom, one not written in his usual hand, but in smaller script, hurried, almost childlike. Do not look for the tower. It is in all of us, the place where courage and mercy meet. You read it twice before realizing the page is warm, as though someone invisible just placed a hand over yours. Maybe that's imagination, or maybe that's what happens when you open a letter written in both ink and soul. Outside, wind rattles the windows of the headmaster's office, a final whisper of the storm that once claimed him. You can almost hear the echo of his robes sweeping across the stones, the soft click of a phoenix landing somewhere unseen. The next page waits, heavy as destiny, ready to tell what came after the fall, when truth, finally, was left for the living to decide. The 9th page is thinner, almost translucent, as though the parchment itself has grown weary from holding so many secrets. The ink here looks softer too, less gold now, more gray, like dusk settling after a long storm. You run your fingers along the edge, feeling faint indentations beneath the words, as if his quill pressed harder with emotion than control. I did not vanish when I fell, Dumbledore writes. I lingered, as all unfinished lessons do. That opening line carries the quiet ache of a man who knows legacy is both a gift and a punishment. He describes almost gently what came after, how the castle grieved, how portraits whispered of his choices, how even ghosts avoided the tower for months, as if mourning something too real to haunt. He confesses that he never wanted statues or portraits or songs. I wanted, he says, only to be remembered honestly, as someone who tried, failed, and tried again until failure itself forgave me. You can almost hear the scratching of his quill, the slow exhale between sentences. He reflects on the boy he left behind, Harry, and his words read not like justification, but affection. He was the only one who ever asked me why I smiled when everything hurt, he writes. I told him the truth, because it's easier to teach hope when you practice it out loud. You feel a warmth bloom behind your eyes at that. Dumbledore does not romanticize their connection. He calls it what it was, an experiment in faith. I believed in him because he reminded me of everything I failed to save. He was courage uncorrected by wisdom, and that is a kind of magic I never mastered. Halfway through, the tone changes. The parchment vibrates faintly beneath your fingers, the ink glowing just a little brighter. There will be those, he warns, who say that power corrupted me. They are half right. It also cured me. He writes of how the myth of his perfection became a shield for others to hide behind, and how that shield, over time, became a mirror he could no longer face. Every age makes its saints, he notes, and then wonders why none of them stay pure. You think about that for a long moment, about how even now people debate whether Dumbledore was a savior or strategist. His letter doesn't resolve that. It refuses to. Instead, he offers something gentler. If you seek my truth, look for the space between intention and regret. That is where a man's soul actually lives. A faint laugh flickers through the ink next. I do hope someone preserved my lemon drop recipe. You smile in spite of yourself. Even in death, he refuses to let solemnity win. He mentions how he used to leave those candies outside the potions classroom. a peace offering to any student brave enough to face Snape before breakfast. That's your third laugh of the night, and somehow it feels necessary, like air after too much incense. Then, a slow hush returns to the text. "Do not think," he writes, "that death silenced me. It merely translated me." He explains, not literally, but metaphorically, that magic leaves impressions, echoes of thought that live in the walls, the books, the very air. Hogwarts remembers every word spoken in love, he writes. If you ever feel warmth when you open a door here, it's not the torches, it's the gratitude of those who once called this place home. The scholars might call that superstition, but you feel the truth of it now, sitting in this room surrounded by murmuring portraits and dust that smells like wisdom. He refers briefly to the debates about his final years, the hunt for Horcruxes, the strange alliance with Snape, the orchestrated deceptions. History will edit me as it must, he writes. It always does. But I hope they keep at least one error. Perfection makes for dull bedtime stories. There's an elegance in that resignation, a serenity earned rather than inherited. Near the bottom of the page, his words begin to fade, as though the magic binding them is losing strength. You, whoever you are, were meant to find this, he writes. Not because you are chosen, but because you are curious. And curiosity, more than bravery, is what saves us. The parchment hums faintly, then settles. The ink glows once more before cooling to its final tone. The truth buried beneath the ashes is this: love outlasts every war, every wand, every spell. It does not conquer, it endures. You exhale, realizing you've been gripping the edges of the page too tightly. For the first time, the room feels lighter, as though some invisible burden has been lifted. A breeze slips through the open window, rustling the edges of old maps and quills, carrying with it the faint scent of lilac. Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe it's the echo of a girl once loved by two brothers who learned too late what that word means. You turn to the very last page, the final letter of Albus Dumbledore. The parchment is smoother than the rest, its color almost white, its surface unblemished, as though he saved his calmest words for the end. Whatever waits there, you sense it will not be a revelation, but something gentler, a hand resting quietly on the heart before sleep. The final page is unlike the others. Its parchment is pale and weightless, as though crafted from breath rather than paper. No seal, no signature, only faint handwriting that glows when your shadow passes over it. The first line trembles slightly, almost as if it's still being written as you read. If this letter has found its end, then so have I. You hold your breath. Outside, dawn is breaking over the castle, the faintest blue brushing the spires, the lake catching its first shimmer of light. Everything feels suspended between waking and dream. Dumbledore's tone here is different, not confessional, not professorial. It's intimate, as though he's finally speaking as the man behind the legend. I once believed wisdom was the art of knowing what to say. Now I think it's learning when to listen. He speaks of peace, not the grand, dramatic kind the world writes about, but the quiet sort that grows in the space between guilt and forgiveness. The world moves on without us, he writes, and that is its greatest mercy. He imagines the students of tomorrow laughing in corridors where he once whispered apologies into the walls and hopes they never know his name beyond a passing joke about sweets or socks. If they remember me at all, he says, let it be as someone who tried to make the difficult things sound simple. You smile at that. It's exactly what he always did. Reduce the unbearable into something teachable, something even a frightened 11-year-old could hold in their pocket. There's a short pause in the ink, just a gap, as if his quill hovered mid-air before continuing. Perhaps you are wondering, he writes, why I left this for you. The truth is, I do not know who you are. That is precisely why I trust you. History will always belong to the curious you swallow hard, realizing that this letter was never meant for a specific name. It was written for anyone who still believes knowledge is an act of love. The world will tell you that power is influence, he continues. But influence fades. What endures is attention, the quiet art of noticing what others forget. It's the kind of line you can imagine him saying with that faint twinkle, the one that dared you to think deeper. Midway down the page, the handwriting shifts slightly, larger, more deliberate. If you have come this far, then you have already done what few wizards ever manage. You have listened, you feel warmth rise in your chest. He explains that he placed a small enchantment on the parchment. Nothing dangerous, just a charm of resonance. When you read it, the letter listens back, he reveals. Every heartbeat, every pause, every breath becomes part of the memory it keeps. You glance down, startled, realizing that maybe that faint humming sound in the background isn't imagination at all. It's your pulse being recorded into Dumbledore's final magic. Somewhere, somehow, your act of listening has made you part of the story. He adds a small note about the afterlife, not in religious terms, but philosophical ones. If there is a beyond, I suspect it is not a place but a realization that everything we ever loved was never lost, merely translated. You feel that sentence settle like a feather in your chest. He references one last academic curiosity, almost playfully, an ancient Greek philosopher who believed memory was the only true form of resurrection. Perhaps that is why ghosts linger, he muses. Not because they are trapped, but because we keep calling them. The humor returns one last time, soft and mischievous. Should you find yourself in possession of my old socks, please burn them. They were enchanted against moths, but not embarrassment. You laugh aloud this time, and somehow, that feels exactly right. Like breaking the spell with warmth instead of sorrow. Then the tone turns to farewell. You will go on from here, he writes, and the world will continue to be terrible and beautiful in equal measure. When it is cruel, be curious. When it is kind, remember. And when it is silent, listen. The ink brightens for a moment, filling the last line with a glow like sunrise through glass. Love is not a spell, nor a weakness, nor a promise. It is what remains when the magic is gone. The words fade as you read them, until all that's left is the faint outline of his initials, a D, and a lingering sense that someone just placed a hand on your shoulder and smiled. You sit there for a long while, the tower waking around you, portraits stirring, gears ticking, owls shifting on their perches. The letter lies still now, no longer glowing, no longer humming, just parchment again. You fold it carefully, feeling its warmth fade into your palms, and slip it back into its envelope. The window glows pink with morning. The castle exhales. Somewhere deep in the walls, a faint echo of laughter drifts, soft and familiar, like a phoenix singing in sleep. You realize you've reached not the end of Dumbledore's letter, but the quiet that follows understanding. Now you lean back in the chair, let the dawn breeze touch your face, and close your eyes. The sound of distant bells mingles with the whisper of feathers. The world feels lighter somehow, not because the story was easy, but because it was honest. You let that honesty settle in your chest, the kind that doesn't demand belief, only stillness. And as your breathing slows, the light deepens around you, and the voice that once belonged to Albus Dumbledore fades into something softer still, the voice of calm itself, saying without words, "Rest now, the lesson is learned." The candle beside you has nearly melted to nothing. The wax pools quietly, its last flicker stretching long shadows across the desk. Outside, morning breaks fully over the hills, pale gold and gentle, spilling through the old tower window. The world no longer hums with magic or memory. It hums with stillness. You breathe it in. You realize that somewhere between the first line and the last, the letter stopped being Dumbledore's and became yours. It is now a story about loss made livable, about mistakes becoming teachers, and about how even the greatest among us only ever sought what we all do, peace enough to sleep. Your eyes drift to the portraits. Some pretend to snooze, others watch with quiet fondness. The instruments on the shelves have gone still, their ticking replaced by the faint rhythm of your breathing. It's the same rhythm the letter listened to, the same sound Dumbledore meant to capture. Proof that curiosity, even now, keeps the world alive. You let your thoughts fade one by one. The tower, the letter, the weight of history. The only thing left is light, soft, forgiving, endless. Somewhere in that silence you can almost hear his final whisper. Not an order, not even advice, just gratitude for listening. So you close your eyes, feeling the morning air drift over your skin, cool and clean. The sound of distant birds rises, faint and far away, and the room around you blurs into comfort. The story ends the way all the best ones do, not with revelation, but with quiet. You exhale, slow and steady, and let yourself drift towards sleep, carrying with you the simplest truth of all, that every ending, gently told, is just another way of saying goodnight.